Abandoned dog appears as baby drowns, and his actions surprise everyone. The sun rose over Cedar Ridge, casting a warm glow on the quaint houses that lined Maple Street. At number 42, the Carter family home stood proudly, its white picket fence a testament to the American dream. Inside, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air as Rachel Carter, a petite brunette with kind eyes, bustled about the kitchen. "John, Emma, Luke, breakfast's ready," Rachel called out, her voice carrying up the stairs. Moments later, the thundering of footsteps announced the arrival of Emma, 14, and Luke, 10, their faces bright with the promise of a new day. They were followed closely by Max, the family's loyal German shepherd, his tail wagging furiously as he anticipated his own breakfast. John Carter, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a warm smile, descended the stairs last, adjusting his tie. He planted a kiss on Rachel's cheek before sitting down at the table. "Morning, beautiful," he said, his eyes twinkling. "What would I do without you?" Rachel blushed, still affected by her husband's charm after all these years. "Starve, probably," she teased, setting a plate of pancakes in front of him. As the family ate, they chatted about their plans for the day. Emma had a big math test, Luke was excited about his upcoming soccer game, and John was preparing for an important presentation at work. "Don't forget, we're having dinner at the Thompsons tonight," Rachel reminded them, "so everyone needs to be home by 6, sharp." After breakfast, John knelt down to give Max a good scratch behind the ears. "Take care of the fort while we're gone, buddy," he said, earning an enthusiastic lick in response. As the Carters left for their respective destinations, none of them could have imagined how their lives were about to change. The perfect life they had built was balanced on a knife's edge, and it would take only the slightest push to send it all tumbling down. 2 weeks later, the atmosphere in the Carter household had shifted dramatically. John sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands, a crumpled letter on the table before him. Rachel stood by the sink, her face a mask of concern and fear. How could this happen? "John," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "I thought everything was going so well at the firm." John looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and tired. "Budget cuts," he said bitterly. "They're downsizing the entire department, 20 years of loyalty, and this is how they repay me." The news of John's sudden unemployment had hit the family like a thunderbolt. The security they had taken for granted was now slipping through their fingers like sand. "We'll figure something out," Rachel said, trying to sound optimistic. "You'll find another job. We just need to tighten our belts for a while." John nodded, but his eyes told a different story. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, suffocating his usually confident demeanor. As the days turned into weeks, the strain began to show. Bill after bill piled up on the kitchen counter, each one a reminder of their dwindling resources. John spent his days glued to his laptop, sending out resumes and making phone calls, but the job market was unforgiving. Emma and Luke, sensing the tension, began to withdraw. Dinner times, once filled with laughter and stories, now passed in uncomfortable silence. Even Max seemed to feel the change, his usual exuberance dampened by the heavy atmosphere in the house. One evening, as Rachel was doing the dishes, she overheard John on the phone in the living room. "I understand, Mr. Thompson," John was saying, his voice laced with desperation. "But if you could just give me a little more time—" "No, please. I promise I'll have the money by next month." Rachel's heart sank. She hadn't realized things had gotten so bad, that John was borrowing money from their friends. Later that night, as they lay in bed, Rachel turned to John. "Why didn't you tell me about borrowing from the Thompsons?" she asked. John sighed heavily. "I didn't want to worry you," he said. "I thought I could handle it." "We're supposed to be partners, John," Rachel said, hurt evident in her voice. "We should be facing this together." I know, John replied, frustration creeping into his tone. "But what do you want me to do? I'm trying my best here." "Are you?" Rachel snapped, immediately regretting her words. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the first crack in the foundation of their marriage, a harbinger of the storms to come. Outside their bedroom door, Max whined softly, sensing the discord between his beloved humans. Little did he know, his own world was about to be turned upside down. As financial pressures mounted, the Carter household became a pressure cooker of stress and resentment. John's unemployment stretched into its third month, and the family's savings were rapidly dwindling. Arguments between John and Rachel grew more frequent and heated, often erupting over the smallest of issues. One particularly tense evening, as John pored over job listings at the kitchen table, Rachel approached him with a stack of bills in her hand. "John, we need to talk about our expenses," she said, her voice strained. "We can't keep going on like this." John looked up, irritation flashing in his eyes. "What do you want me to do, Rachel? Pull a job out of thin air?" "That's not what I'm saying," Rachel replied, struggling to keep her tone even. "But we need to start making some tough decisions. We might have to consider selling the car, or—" "Sell the car," John interrupted, his voice rising. "And how am I supposed to get to job interviews? Have you thought about that?" Their voices escalated, neither willing to back down. In the living room, Emma and Luke exchanged worried glances. The sound of their parents' argument all too familiar now. Suddenly, a crash from the kitchen made them all jump. In the heat of the argument, Rachel had gesticulated wildly, knocking over a vase. Water and flowers spilled across the floor, and Max, startled by the noise, came bounding into the kitchen. In his excitement, Max slipped on the wet floor, colliding with John and sending him stumbling backward. John's elbow caught the edge of the table, and he let out a cry of pain. "Damn it, Max!" John shouted, frustration and pain overriding his usual affection for the dog. "Get out of here!" Max whimpered and retreated, tail between his legs. The kitchen fell silent, the argument forgotten in the wake of the chaos. Later that night, as the house slept, John sat alone in the darkened living room. His mind raced with worry and shame. He felt like a failure, unable to provide for his family, watching his marriage crumble, and now lashing out at poor Max. As if summoned by John's thoughts, Max padded softly into the room. The dog approached cautiously, still wary after the earlier incident. John's heart clenched with guilt. "Come here, boy," he said softly, patting the couch beside him. Max hesitated for a moment before jumping up, resting his head on John's lap. As John stroked the dog's soft fur, an idea began to form in his mind. It was a terrible, heartbreaking idea, but in his desperation, it seemed like the only solution. The next morning, John woke early. He moved quietly through the house, gathering Max's things, his leash, his favorite toy, a bag of food. With a heavy heart, he clipped the leash to Max's collar and led him out to the car. "We're just going for a little drive, buddy," John said, his voice thick with unshed tears. As they drove out of Cedar Ridge, Max's tail wagged happily, oblivious to what was about to happen. John's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his resolve wavering with every mile. Finally, they arrived at a rest stop just outside of town. John parked the car and led Max to a grassy area. He knelt down, hugging the dog tightly. "I'm sorry, Max," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, but we can't take care of you anymore. You'll be better off without us." With trembling hands, John unclipped Max's leash. He stood up quickly, unable to look into those trusting brown eyes any longer. Before he could change his mind, he turned and ran back to the car. As John drove away, he could see Max in the rearview mirror, standing confused and alone. The image burned itself into his memory, a testament to his failure and the depths of his despair. Little did John know, this decision would set in motion a chain of events that would test his family to their very limits and ultimately lead to their salvation. As the sound of John's car faded into the distance, Max stood motionless, his ears perked and his eyes fixed on the spot where his beloved human had disappeared. Confusion and anxiety radiated from every fiber of his being. Why had John left him here? When would he come back? For hours, Max waited faithfully at the rest stop, his hope never wavering. Families came and went. Children pointed and cooed at him, but Max paid them no mind. His focus remained unbroken, his loyalty unshakable. As night fell and the temperature dropped, reality began to set in. John wasn't coming back. With a whine of distress, Max finally moved from his vigil. His nose twitched as he caught the fading scent of John's car. Without hesitation, Max set off, following the scent. He was going home. The journey ahead was long and treacherous. Max trotted along the side of the highway, his powerful legs eating up the miles. But as the night wore on, exhaustion began to take its toll. His pace slowed, and hunger gnawed at his belly. As dawn broke, Max found himself in unfamiliar territory. The scent of home was faint now, masked by the overwhelming smells of the city he had wandered into. Confused and frightened by the noise and bustle, Max retreated into an alley, curling up behind a dumpster to rest. Meanwhile, back in Cedar Ridge, the Carter household was in turmoil. Rachel had woken to find Max gone and John acting strangely evasive. It didn't take long for the truth to come out. "You did what?" Rachel screamed, her face contorted with fury and disbelief. "I had to do something," John shouted back, his guilt manifesting as anger. "We can barely feed ourselves, let alone a dog." "He's family, John. How could you just abandon him like that?" Their argument was interrupted by the sound of sobbing. They turned to see Emma and Luke standing in the doorway, tears streaming down their faces. "You got rid of Max," Luke wailed, his small body shaking with sobs. Emma, her face a mask of betrayal, turned and ran to her room, slamming the door behind her. As John looked at the devastation on his family's faces, the full weight of what he had done came crashing down on him. He sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "What have I done?" he whispered, his voice broken. Rachel, torn between comforting her children and confronting her husband, stood frozen in place. The chasm between them seemed to widen with each passing second. Back in the city, Max had begun his search anew. He wandered the streets, nose to the ground, desperately seeking a familiar scent. But the city was vast and confusing, full of dangers he had never encountered before. As night fell again, Max found himself in a park. Exhausted and hungry, he lapped at a puddle of murky water, his once gleaming coat now matted and dirty. A group of teenagers, spotting the collarless dog, approached with friendly whistles. "Here, boy, come here," one of them called, holding out a piece of hot dog. Max, driven by hunger, cautiously approached. As he took the offered food, he felt a hand grip his scruff. Panic set in, and Max twisted free, bolting away into the darkness. The incident left Max even more wary, but it couldn't dampen his determination. With each step, with each day that passed, his resolve only grew stronger. Somewhere out there, beyond the confusing maze of city streets and unfamiliar scents, was home. And Max was determined to find it. As he curled up under a bush to sleep, his dreams were filled with images of the Carter family, of Emma's gentle pets, Luke's exuberant play, Rachel's warm hugs, and John's comforting presence. In his sleep, Max whimpered softly, his paws twitching as if still on the long journey home. Little did Max know, his journey was far from over, and back in Cedar Ridge, the Carters were about to face their own arduous path, one that would test the very foundations of their family. The days following Max's disappearance were some of the darkest the Carter family had ever experienced. The house, once filled with the sounds of laughter and playful barks, now echoed with a hollow silence that seemed to amplify every harsh word and stifled sob. Emma had retreated into a shell of anger and resentment, barely speaking to her parents, especially John. Luke, on the other hand, had become clingy and anxious, plagued by nightmares of Max lost and alone. Rachel threw herself into action, plastering the neighborhood with lost dog posters and scouring local shelters. But as days turned into weeks with no sign of Max, even her optimism began to wane. John, consumed by guilt and shame, grew more withdrawn. He spent his days mechanically sending out job applications, but his heart wasn't in it. The weight of his decision hung around his neck like a millstone, dragging him deeper into depression. One evening, as Rachel was clearing up after another tense and silent family dinner, she found John in the garage, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in his hand. "John," she said softly, her voice a mixture of concern and disappointment, "this isn't the answer." John looked up at her, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused. "What is the answer then, Rachel? Tell me, because I sure as hell don't know anymore." Rachel sat down beside him, gently taking the bottle from his hand. "We need help, John. Professional help. We can't keep going on like this." John laughed bitterly. "And how do you suggest we pay for that, with all this money we don't have?" "We'll figure it out," Rachel insisted. "We have to, for the kids, if nothing else." As they talked, neither of them noticed Emma standing in the shadows of the doorway, listening. Her young heart ached at seeing her parents, once so strong and united, now broken and lost. Meanwhile, miles away, Max's journey continued. He had managed to leave the confusing maze of the city behind, guided by an instinct he didn't understand but trusted implicitly. His path took him through suburbs and farmland, each day bringing new challenges. One rainy afternoon, exhausted and hungry, Max stumbled upon a small farm. The scent of food drew him to the back porch, where a kind-faced woman was setting out scraps for a group of cats. "Oh, you poor thing," the woman exclaimed upon seeing Max's bedraggled form. "Where did you come from?" Max, wary but desperate, allowed the woman to approach. She fed him and even let him sleep in the barn that night. For a moment, Max was tempted by the comfort and kindness. But as dawn broke, the pull of home proved stronger. While the farmer's wife slept, Max slipped away, continuing his journey. Back in Cedar Ridge, the Carters' financial situation was reaching a critical point. Bill collectors called daily, and the threat of foreclosure loomed over their heads. One afternoon, Rachel returned home to find John sitting at the kitchen table, a stack of papers in front of him. "What's all this?" she asked, setting down her groceries. John took a deep breath. "I've been thinking, maybe we should consider bankruptcy." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Rachel sank into a chair, the weight of their situation pressing down on her shoulders. "Bankruptcy," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "John, is it really that bad?" John nodded grimly. "I don't see any other way out, Rachel. We're drowning in debt and I still can't find a job. At least this way we might have a chance to start over." Rachel's mind raced with the implications. Bankruptcy would mean a fresh start, yes, but it would also mean giving up their home, the home where they had raised their children, where they had built their life together. "What about the kids?" she asked. "How will this affect them?" "I don't know," John admitted, running a hand through his hair. "But staying on this path isn't doing them any favors either. They're already suffering because of our problems." As if on cue, they heard the front door open and Emma's voice call out, "I'm home." Rachel and John exchanged a look. They would have to tell the children soon, but for now they silently agreed to keep this conversation between themselves. Emma entered the kitchen, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She paused, sensing the tension in the room. "What's going on?" she asked, her eyes darting between her parents. "Nothing, sweetie," Rachel said, forcing a smile. "How was school?" Emma shrugged, clearly not buying the deflection, but choosing not to push. "Fine," she mumbled, heading for the stairs. As Emma retreated to her room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to change. She flopped onto her bed, her eyes landing on a framed photo on her nightstand. It was a picture of the whole family, including Max, taken at the park last summer. They all looked so happy, so carefree. Emma felt a lump form in her throat as she wondered if they would ever be that family again. Meanwhile, Max's journey had taken him to the outskirts of a small town. His paws were sore, his coat matted and dirty, but his determination never wavered. As he trotted along the side of a quiet road, a car slowed beside him. "Hey there, buddy," a man's voice called out. "You lost." Max turned to see a middle-aged man leaning out of his car window. Something about the man's kind eyes reminded Max of John, and he felt a glimmer of hope. The man, seeing Max's collarless neck and bedraggled appearance, made a decision. He pulled over and got out of the car, approaching Max slowly. "It's okay, boy," he said softly. "I'm not going to hurt you. Let's see if we can find out where you belong." Max, too tired to run and sensing no threat from the man, allowed himself to be led to the car. As they drove towards the local animal shelter, Max gazed out the window, his canine brain trying to make sense of his journey. Little did Max know, this chance encounter would set in motion a series of events that would eventually lead him back to Cedar Ridge and to a family that desperately needed him. Back at the Carter house, John and Rachel sat at the kitchen table long into the night, poring over their finances and discussing their limited options. The weight of their decision pressed heavily upon them, but beneath the stress and fear, a small spark of hope began to flicker. Perhaps, they thought, this could be the fresh start they needed, a chance to rebuild not just their finances, but their family as well. As they finally headed to bed in the early hours of the morning, Rachel paused in the hallway. Through the crack in Emma's door, she could see her daughter sleeping fitfully. The framed family photo clutched to her chest. Rachel's heart ached with love and worry for her children. "We'll find a way through this," she whispered to herself. "We have to." Little did the Carters know, their path to healing was already in motion, carried forward on 4 tired paws, driven by a love that knew no bounds. Max's journey was far from over, and with each step, he was bringing hope back to the family that had lost so much more than just their beloved pet. As dawn broke over Cedar Ridge, the Carter family faced a day that would change their lives forever. John and Rachel had decided it was time to tell the children about their financial situation and the possibility of bankruptcy. They gathered Emma and Luke in the living room, the tension palpable in the air. John cleared his throat, his voice unsteady as he began to explain. "Kids, your mom and I have something important to tell you," he said. "We've been having some financial problems, and we might have to declare bankruptcy." Luke's brow furrowed in confusion. "What does that mean?" he asked. Rachel took a deep breath. "It means we might have to sell the house and move somewhere smaller. We'd have to start over, in a way." Emma's eyes widened in shock. "Move? But this is our home. We can't just leave." "I know it's hard to understand," John said, his heart breaking at the distress on his children's faces. "But sometimes adults have to make tough decisions for the good of the family." Emma stood up abruptly, her face a mask of anger and hurt. "This family?" she spat. "What family? Ever since you got rid of Max, we haven't been a family at all." With that, she stormed out of the room, leaving a heavy silence in her wake. Luke burst into tears, and Rachel pulled him close, her own eyes brimming with unshed tears. John sat there, feeling more lost and helpless than ever. How had they come to this? And more importantly, how could they ever find their way back? Miles away, Max's journey had taken an unexpected turn. The kind man who had picked him up had indeed taken him to an animal shelter, but fate had other plans. As they pulled into the shelter's parking lot, a commotion caught their attention. A group of volunteers was loading cages into a van, and one of the cages had come open. A scared cat darted out, heading straight for the busy street. Without hesitation, Max leapt from the car and sprang into action. His herding instincts kicked in, and he managed to guide the terrified cat away from the traffic and back towards the shelter staff. The shelter director, who had witnessed the entire scene, was impressed by Max's intelligence and bravery. After scanning for a microchip and finding none, she made a decision. "This dog is special," she told her staff. "Let's see if we can find him a home through our partner rescue in the next county. They have a great track record with placing dogs in forever homes." And so, instead of ending up in the local shelter, Max found himself on another journey. As the rescue van drove away, Max pressed his nose against the cage door, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Somehow, he knew he was getting closer to home. Back in Cedar Ridge, the Carters were struggling to come to terms with their new reality. Emma had barely spoken to her parents in days, spending most of her time locked in her room. Luke had become even more withdrawn, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by a quiet sadness. Rachel threw herself into researching their options, spending hours on the phone with financial advisors and bankruptcy lawyers. John, feeling helpless in the face of his family's pain, decided to take action in the only way he knew how. One evening, he sat down at the kitchen table with a stack of paper and began to write. He wrote letters to everyone he knew, old colleagues, college friends, distant relatives, explaining his situation and asking if they knew of any job opportunities. As he wrote, John felt a glimmer of the determination that had once defined him. He might have made mistakes, but he wasn't going to give up without a fight. Rachel found him there in the early hours of the morning, surrounded by stamped envelopes. She placed a hand on his shoulder, and for the first time in months, they shared a moment of true connection. "We're going to get through this," Rachel said softly. "Together." John covered her hand with his own, a small smile playing on his lips. "Together," he echoed. As they stood there in the quiet kitchen, a fragile hope began to bloom. They had a long way to go, but they had taken the first step on the path to healing. Little did they know, their journey was about to intersect with another, one that had started on 4 paws and had traversed miles of uncertainty and hardship. Max's unwavering love and loyalty were drawing him ever closer to home, and with him, he carried the key to the Carters' redemption. The stage was set for a reunion that would not only bring a beloved pet back to his family, but would also catalyze the rebirth of a family teetering on the brink of dissolution. As dawn broke on Cedar Ridge, the threads of fate were drawing tighter, weaving together a tapestry of love, forgiveness, and second chances. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity for the Carter family. John's letter-writing campaign had yielded unexpected results. He received responses from old contacts he hadn't spoken to in years, each offering words of encouragement and promises to keep an ear out for opportunities. One afternoon, as John was sifting through the day's mail, he came across an envelope that made his heart skip a beat. It was from his former college roommate, now a successful business owner in a neighboring town. With trembling hands, John opened the letter and began to read. As his eyes scanned the pages, "Tom, he's offering me a job at his company." Rachel's eyes widened in disbelief. "A job? John, that's wonderful." As the news sank in, they both felt a weight lifting from their shoulders. It wasn't a solution to all their problems, but it was a start, a glimmer of hope in the darkness that had engulfed them for so long. That evening, they shared the news with Emma and Luke over dinner. For the first time in weeks, "Can we try to find him?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions. John felt the familiar pang of guilt, but before he could respond, Rachel reached out and took Emma's hand. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We never stopped looking for Max, and we won't stop, I promise you that." As the family continued to talk, sharing their hopes and fears, a sense of unity began to emerge, fragile but real. They were taking the first steps towards healing, towards becoming a family again. Meanwhile, Max's journey had taken yet another unexpected turn. The rescue organization that had taken him in had a policy of fostering dogs in homes before adopting them out. And so, Max found himself in a comfortable suburban house, cared for by a kind elderly couple. The couple doted on Max, impressed by his intelligence and gentle nature. But despite their kindness, Max remained restless. Each day he would sit by the front window, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if waiting for something or someone. One sunny afternoon, as the couple was preparing to take Max for his daily walk, something extraordinary happened. As they opened the front door, Max's ears perked up. A familiar scent had caught his attention, a scent he hadn't encountered in months, but would recognize anywhere. Without warning, Max bolted out the door, his powerful legs carrying him down the street at breakneck speed. The elderly couple called after him in alarm, but Max was focused on one thing only, following that scent home. As fate would have it, John had decided to take a drive that day, following up on a lead for a potential client for his new job. His route had taken him through the very neighborhood where Max had been staying. As John drove slowly down the tree-lined street, lost in thought about the future, a blur of motion caught his eye. He slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding in his chest. Could it be? Max skidded to a halt in front of John's car, his tail wagging furiously, his eyes fixed on the man behind the wheel. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as man and dog stared at each other in disbelief. Then, with a choked sob, John flung open the car door. "Max!" he cried, dropping to his knees on the pavement. "Oh God, Max!" Max bounded forward, nearly knocking John over in his excitement. He covered John's face with eager licks. whining with joy at being reunited with his beloved human. As John hugged Max tightly, tears streaming down his face, he felt a sense of completion he hadn't experienced in months. It was as if the final piece of a puzzle had fallen into place. The elderly couple, who had been chasing after Max, arrived on the scene, panting and confused. John, still holding on to Max as if afraid he might disappear, explained the situation through tears and laughter. Understanding dawned on the couple's faces, and they insisted that John take Max home immediately. "This is meant to be," the old woman said, smiling through her own tears. "He always seemed to be waiting for someone. Now we know who." As John drove home, Max sitting proudly in the passenger seat, he felt a sense of lightness he hadn't experienced in months. He couldn't wait to see the looks on his family's faces when he walked through the door with their long-lost friend. Little did John know, Max's return was about to catalyze a series of events that would not only bring joy back into their lives, but also heal the deep wounds that had threatened to tear their family apart. The stage was set for a reunion that would remind the Carters of the unbreakable bonds of love and the power of second chances. The sun was setting over Cedar Ridge as John's car pulled into the driveway of 42 Maple Street. His heart was pounding with anticipation, a mix of joy and nervousness coursing through his veins. Beside him, Max sat alert, his tail thumping against the seat in a steady rhythm of excitement. John took a deep breath, turning to look at Max. "Ready to go home, buddy?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Max responded with an eager bark, and John couldn't help but laugh. For the first time in months, genuine happiness bubbled up inside him. As they approached the front door, John could hear the muffled sounds of his family inside. He paused for a moment, then opened the door. "Rachel, kids, I'm home," he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "And I've brought someone with me." There was a moment of confused silence, then the sound of footsteps. Rachel appeared first, her eyes widening in disbelief as she took in the sight before her. "Oh my God," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. Is that Max?" Before John could respond, Emma and Luke came barreling down the hallway, drawn by the commotion. They froze in their tracks, identical expressions of shock on their faces. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, with a joyful bark, Max bounded forward. The spell was broken, and chaos erupted. Emma fell to her knees, wrapping her arms around Max's neck as tears streamed down her face. Luke was right behind her, his small hands buried in Max's fur, laughing and crying at the same time. Rachel moved forward slowly, as if in a dream. She reached out a trembling hand to touch Max's head, then looked up at John. Their eyes met, and in that moment, all the anger and resentment of the past months seemed to melt away. "How?" Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John shook his head, still scarcely believing it himself. "It's a long story," he said, "but he found me. After all this time, he found his way back to us." As the family huddled together on the floor, laughing and crying and hugging Max, John felt something shift inside him. The guilt and shame that had been his constant companions began to lift, replaced by a sense of hope and determination. Later that evening, after the initial excitement had died down and Max had been fed, bathed and fussed over, the Carter family gathered in the living room. Max lay contentedly in the middle of the room, basking in the attention and love surrounding him. John cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "I owe you all an apology," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. "Especially you, Max. What I did, it was wrong. I was scared and desperate, and I made a terrible mistake." John's voice cracked as he continued, "I thought I was doing what was best for our family, but I realize now that I was wrong. Max isn't just a pet, he's a part of our family, and families stick together, no matter what." Emma, who had been sitting silently, her hand resting on Max's back, looked up at her father. The anger that had been simmering in her eyes for months seemed to soften. "Dad," she said quietly, "I was so mad at you. I thought you didn't care about us anymore." John felt his heart constrict at his daughter's words. He moved to kneel in front of her, taking her hands in his. "Emma, sweetheart, I have always cared. I love you, your brother, your mom, and Max more than anything in this world. I lost sight of what was truly important, but I promise you, I'll never make that mistake again." Luke, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up. "Are we going to be okay now, Dad? Are we going to stay together?" Rachel joined them on the floor, pulling Luke into her lap. "We're going to do everything we can to stay together," she said, looking at John with a mix of love and determination. "Your dad has a new job opportunity, and we're going to work hard to fix our problems." John nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "That's right, it won't be easy, and we have a lot of work ahead of us, but we're going to face it together. As a family." Max, sensing the emotional atmosphere, got up and moved to the center of their little circle. He licked John's face, then Emma's, bringing smiles to everyone's faces. "Look at that," Rachel said, laughing softly. "Even after everything, he still loves us unconditionally. Maybe we could all learn something from Max." As the family sat there, huddled together with Max in the center, a sense of peace settled over them. The road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in months, they felt like they could face anything as long as they were together. Over the next few weeks, the Carters worked tirelessly to rebuild their lives and their relationships. John threw himself into his new job, determined to provide for his family and regain their trust. Rachel took on part-time work to help with the finances, and together they slowly began to chip away at their debt. Emma and Luke, buoyed by Max's return and the renewed sense of unity in the family, began to thrive once again. Emma's grades improved, and Luke's nightmares subsided. The sound of laughter, which had been absent for so long, once again filled the halls of 42 Maple Street. As for Max, he slipped back into family life as if he had never left, but there was a new appreciation for his presence, a deepened bond that came from the shared experience of loss and reunion. One sunny Saturday, about a month after Max's return, the Carters decided to have a picnic in the park. As they spread out their blanket under a shady tree, John looked around at his family. Rachel was laughing as she tried to keep Max from stealing sandwiches from the basket. Emma was teaching Luke how to throw a frisbee, their faces alight with joy. In that moment, John felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. They had been through so much, teetered on the brink of losing everything, but here they were, together, stronger and more united than ever. As if sensing his thoughts, Max trotted over and sat beside John, resting his head on John's knee. John scratched behind Max's ears, smiling down at the loyal companion who had journeyed so far to bring their family back together. "Thank you, boy," John whispered, "for everything." Max looked up at him with those soulful brown eyes, and John could have sworn he saw understanding there. Then, with a playful bark, Max bounded off to join Emma and Luke in their frisbee game. Rachel came to sit beside John, intertwining her fingers with his. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, following his gaze to where their children played with Max. John squeezed her hand gently. "I'm thinking about how lucky we are," he said, "and how sometimes the things that test us the most are the things that make us strongest." Rachel leaned her head on his shoulder, a contented sigh escaping her lips. "We still have a long way to go," she said, "but we're on the right path now." John nodded, pulling her close. "Yes, we are," he agreed, "and we're going to walk it together, all of us." As the afternoon sun bathed Cedar Ridge in a warm, golden light, the Carter family continued their picnic. Their laughter carried on the gentle breeze. They had weathered the storm, faced their darkest moments, and come out on the other side, scarred perhaps, but stronger for it. And at the heart of it all was Max, the loyal German shepherd who had traveled miles and overcome countless obstacles to find his way back home. His journey had not just reunited him with his family, it had brought the Carters back to each other, reminding them of the unbreakable bonds of love that could weather any storm. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, the Carters packed up their picnic and headed home. Max trotted alongside them, his tail wagging contentedly. He was where he belonged, surrounded by the people he loved most in the world. And as for the Carters, They walked with a new spring in their step, their hearts full of hope for the future. They had learned a valuable lesson, that true wealth lies not in material possessions or financial security, but in the love and support of family. With that knowledge, they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that as long as they had each other and their faithful Max, they could overcome anything.